Bom dia, buenos dias, good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I've been asked to speak in English. I could have spoken in Spanish, but we have a wonderful translator for those who need it. So, very briefly, at the core of what the circular economy is all about is it's an industrial system and economy that is regenerative by design. So to ask the question, can we actually create a regenerative tourism? Seems to be appropriate in this context. And let me just find where, I'll move the slides. I like to start with an image of this wonderful planet that we inhabit because it gives us context for where we are now and what we need to do very rapidly in the next few years in order to avoid that the future of this wonderful planet looks rather grim, and with it, our own future. If you look at that tiny little blue line here on the side, let me see if this works. No, it doesn't. Anyway, you can see how thin the atmosphere is around the globe. And the atmosphere we're breathing was generated by life itself. If you look at all the other planets in our solar system, they have an atmosphere that is in chemical equilibrium. All the reactions that can happen have happened. The fact that our atmosphere is in extreme chemical disequilibrium and has much more oxygen than it should is because life is there. So during 3.8 billion years, life has created conditions conducive to life. And the one job we have to do as part of life, as part of that community of life, is to fall into that pattern. And unfortunately, we've done the exact opposite. You can see in this slide how much energy we blast into the night sky every night. And you can also see our wonderful island here in the center, Mallorca. And bringing us even closer home to Mallorca and its addiction to tourism as part of its economy, it's important to understand that if we didn't have San Jordi and almost 30 million flights arriving in a year, then a lot of the tourism that has made this island rich wouldn't be there. But we're also in a situation where flying is a big issue with regard to climate change. One thing that most of you who live on Mallorca will know, I thought there would be more international participants, so I put this slide in, is that Mallorca also has the pre-warning station that warns humanity against the possibility of a possible meteorite impact. And of the 5 existential risks that humanity faces, that's one of them, but much more imminent right now is the issue of climate change and cascading ecosystems collapse. And as we've seen just this year, some businesses de toda la vida, some businesses that have been part of the tourism industry since its inception, can also go bust. And if we look at the issue of the emissions generated by aviation and how far we are with this little plane over there being in the first commercially viable electric plane, I don't think we're going to get quite so many tourists to the island in planes like that. So we really need to start to rethink tourism fundamentally. And let me just give you a couple of, I really want to bring into the room the fierce urgency of now. That it's not enough anymore to have conversations about just circular tourism and how one industry can adjust a little bit to do things a little bit better. It's actually about the industry asking, how can we be of service to the greatest transformation in human history? How can we be of service to the redesign of the human presence and impact on planet Earth within the generations alive today? This data comes from some work that I did just before I moved to Mallorca by now almost 9 years ago. And I did this work for UK Foresight, which is the UK government's long-range future scanning office that looks at problems that the government should have in mind as it plans long-range policies. And what we looked at is, back in 2009, 2010, we looked at all the IPCC data and divided the globe in 18 regions, and then studied the climate change impact on those regions, and then the connections that the UK had with all those regions, to give the government an indication of what kind of supply lines might be cut, what kind of cultural, historical connections might oblige them to be in solidarity with countries like India, where tens of thousands of people are dying because of climate change every year already. And at that time, the then chief scientist of the UK, Professor John Beddington, pointed out this dynamic between that by 2050 we need more water, we need more energy, we need more food, but climate change negatively affects all three of these. And so there is a cluster of problems affecting each other that will, by 2030, lead us into what he called a perfect storm. And of course, all of these issues affect biodiversity. And biodiversity is probably the one measure that gives us an idea of the state of the planet, the health of the biotic system on which we depend. Just yesterday in The Guardian, there was an article that suggested that we now already have reached tipping points in the climate system. This data here is from the IPCC's last report last year. They gave us 12 years to react. The Secretary General of the United Nations the same year, last year, said we have 3 years to fundamentally change our ways. And just very briefly, there's so many issues that have just happened this year with regard to the fires in Brazil, the amount of methane that is bubbling up in the permafrost areas, adding to climate change. The way that because of this methane and the permafrost melting, there are now many more forest fires and peat fires in the boreal region of the globe, the far northern regions. And then how there's so many feedback loops that we didn't even think of back 10 years ago with the IPCC reports. The way that ice melts faster as it starts melting, the way that we didn't know that melting ice also releases nitrous oxide, and that nitrous oxide is a much stronger greenhouse gas effect molecule than CO2. And so there's an urgency. Probably the one tipping point that we need to watch out for is the acidity of the oceans. If we get to the point that the acidity reaches a certain level, and then all the CO2 that has been stored in the deep ocean sediments starts to get released into the atmosphere, then we basically have to accept that we have triggered irreversible processes that will lead to higher life forms such as ours not having a home on planet Earth for a number of millions of years until evolution bounces back. So it's not about saving the planet, it's about saving our species, and it's about saving the beautiful abundance of diversity that life has created over the last 3.8 billion years. We've been in an ecological overshoot for a very long time. I was born in 1971, and a year before that, humanity already moved into overshoot. And since then, because there's more and more of us and we degrade ecosystems more and more, every year the amount of bioproductive surface area per human is reduced. So we have less and less to share with more and more. And another way of expressing this is that in 1970, we started to live off the capital instead of the interest. We've started to dig into humanity's and life's inheritance, y el patrimonio no se vende. So it's really important to understand that every year, that point where we go into overshoot and we start spending capital instead of living off the bioproductivity the planet can generate in a year, is earlier and earlier. In 2019, as humanity as a whole, this date was July 29th. For Spain, because Spain uses more than the average of humanity, it was in May 28, and the USA even more, March 8th. And the one job we have now, and where circular tourism might be a catalytic element of making this shift, is to begin to roll back this Earth Overshoot Day as quickly as possible. But it's not just environmental problems. This is from the most recent Global Wealth Report put out by Credit Suisse. And if we contemplate just briefly that 10.7% of humanity own and share among them 82.8% of the economic wealth on the planet, while 56.5% of humanity have to, among them, share only 1.8% of the wealth, then the only way to call this is a disgusting level of inequality that is simply unacceptable, and that there is absolutely no reason why to sustain a species that has that kind of level of inequality and somehow assumes that this is justifiable. So we have this role of, on the one hand, pulling humanity back within the planetary boundaries, within the limits that the biophysical reality of this planet sets us to live within, but we also need to build the socio-economic foundations in order for people in place to be able to play a role in this big transformation that we now have to do. And this graphic on the right explains that very well. The green donut-shaped circle is where we need to maintain ourselves. We have to make sure that we don't exceed ecological boundaries and that we stay within the social foundations. And I highly encourage people to have a look at Donut Economics by Kate Raworth. She's a member of the Club of Rome, and this one image gives us a very good fingerprint of where we are and where we need to go. This shows how this overshoot since the 1970s has basically driven so many socioeconomic and Earth systems trends into exponential growth, tourism being one of them. And part of this transformation that we now need to make is to change from the curve up there on the right, the exponential curve, to the logistic curve. All life processes tend to, at the beginning, grow exponentially and then shift from growing quantitatively in size and in numbers to growing qualitatively. If you just think about your own life, you also started to grow to a certain height, and then you stopped, and then you started to develop new skills and qualitative changes. And in many ways, as humanity, we now have to make that shift. We have to grow our economies in a more qualitative way. I'll come back to that in a second. My work is very much about the fact that sustainability is important, but not enough, that we need to, because we have done so much damage over so long, now do more than just be sustainable. And to say just be sustainable is maybe an understatement, because we're far from being sustainable yet. But to understand that we really need to begin to reforest the planet, to make build soil again, to make the foundations of all value creation in an economy is the first sector, and that is agriculture. And we've dismissed agriculture as not being important for far too long. We need the right type of agriculture that helps to regenerate the soils, and we need to pay our farmers not just for the produce they create, but for the role they play in carbon drawdown, in bringing carbon out of the atmosphere back into the soils, and in building soil again, and in maintaining the health of ecosystems. This spectrum I find very useful because it shows us that every step on the way is important, even if we go from conventional practice to just being a little bit better, doing some things within the circular economy, maybe working with food waste in tourism and begin to bring some of that food waste back into composting and growing more food. These are all important steps. Very often they're over-communicated. That's when people call it greenwashing, but it is a step in the right direction. Sustainable is the point where we don't add any more damage, but that's not enough, as I just said. restorative, moving on to the green side of the spectrum, is when we begin to reforest, when we begin to build soil, but we do so with the arrogance of the engineer who tries to force things onto nature. It's only when we make the internal step of really taking in that as biological organisms, we are fundamentally linked with life. We are nature. We're not separate from her. And that we can, as nature, become keystone species in the ecosystems we inhabit and heal the systems we inhabit. And that's really what regenerative cultures is all about. So briefly, you will get a copy of this PowerPoint through the organizers. I always put a lot more information on my slides than people can read while I talk. It's partially to give you something to take away. But I highly recommend looking up this particular report about qualitative growth from 2009, authored by two leading thinkers in systems theory and economics, Fritjof Capra and Hazel Henderson. And what this report sketches out is how do we make that shift from exponential growing economies to economies that grow in quality. And just recently, Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize winner for economics, a couple of days ago, was an article in the news where he said that GDP is a fundamentally insufficient measure of progress. And if we keep measuring whether we're doing all right and whether we're competitive on a global scale as the Mallorcan economy, using PIB, using GDP as the measure, then we're basically still structurally incentivizing behaviors that are about the exploitation of people and planet. There is an inbuilt dysfunctionality in the current economic system that means that there can only be winners if there are losers. It is a zero-sum game where you have to have losers in order to have winners. And you also have to create at least 3% growth per annum, otherwise the whole system collapses. But this system was designed by us, not malintended. We didn't really want to kill the planet and our future, but now that we understand that that's what we're doing, we have the opportunity of fundamentally redesigning our economic system. And tourism has a huge potential in being catalytic in this conversation and in this transformation, because there is hardly a sector in the world that touches quite so many areas, from energy to transport to water to food, infrastructure use. All of that is critically touched by tourism. And for people being on Mallorca, I'm not telling you anything new. But that also means that if you had to find one industry that could take leadership role and take a catalytic role in this transformation, it is also tourism. We heard at the beginning in the opening that we can turn the problem into the solution. And tourism could just be one of those problems. It's one of the fastest growing industries in the world, and the impact is growing as well, but we have a potential of transforming it. Again, I'm not going to go into the detail of all the negative impacts, but just as much as tourism in many paradise islands around the globe and many remote areas has been the thin end of the wedge of neoliberal economic globalization, of this destructive economy coming into places where people were by and large illiterate and living a very basic life, but in a beautiful, pristine landscape. And then by building hotels, by bringing in the economics, yes, maybe things also in some areas went better for people there, but overall it has been the thin end of the wedge for bringing globalization to a lot of places. Similarly, it can be the thin end of the wedge to bring in regenerative economics to those places. And what's critical about that is coming back to a more local and regional scale. So ultimately, we're now at a point where business as usual or tourism as usual is absolutely no longer an option. And we need to find a way to create a tourism that encourages people in place to take active part in regenerating their local ecosystems and their local economies and their local social cohesion. and which is what I call regenerative cultures. One of my mentors, he's also spoken here on Mallorca a number of times, Satish Kumar, has this beautiful turn of phrase of moving from being tourists on planet Earth to becoming pilgrims on planet Earth, where you every step with reverence for the people in the place you're walking and with reverence for the environment you're walking in. And I think that is the future that we need to envision when we talk about circular tourism. And a lot of what we will talk about during the rest of these 2 days are these innovations, tourism in transitions, are these ways that we're making inroads into beginning to transform tourism. And what I'm trying to bring today is, yes, this is critically important, and we need to think in larger contexts. We need to really think about the planetary problem now. So what is this idea of transformational change? It is a complete repatterning of the values and the functionalities of a system. It is not just rearranging elements or doing what we've done just by adding a few little things to the system. So it's not just a few innovations in circular tourism on the side of not touching the golden cow that is making a lot of money for people. It is actually to begin to understand how we can fundamentally transform the role of tourism. And this means, as we redesign the human impact on Earth, many good things have come from globalization. I don't want to say it's all been negative. We're much more aware of being a global species and of our impact, and we've created through tourism a way of meeting other places and other people that have brought us closer together, and all of that is very positive. But if we want to redesign our impact, we can't do it at the planetary scale. The only way we can reach planetary impact is by doing it community by community and bioregion by bioregion. And that's why I brought up these two maps. One of them is all the river systems of Europe. They give us a little idea of what is a biophysical region rather than a human-created region. And in the past, Europe was very much more regional and had these ways of meeting people's needs in the region through the possibilities that that region offered. And that's the space where innovation and tourism could do a lot. We could help to re-regionalize production and consumption in a significant way. And with the negative news about climate change in the last few years, there's been a lot of, we somehow went from, well, maybe climate change isn't real, or it's not as bad as the scientists say, to within this year saying it's too late and we've had it. And what I believe is that this re-regionalization and local or community climate resilience building pathway is actually a solution to both either trying to reverse climate change, which is still possible if we do so everywhere, bioregion by bioregion on a global scale, but it is also the pathway of bringing the production of key elements that local populations depend upon closer to home. And again, I think that particularly in places like Mallorca, where tourism is so dominant in the economy, tourism plays a key role in that transformation. So why do I say bioregional, circular, biomaterials economies? The key principles of the circular economy is to design out waste and pollution, to keep products and materials in use at their highest value, and to regenerate natural systems. But if you really tunnel into some of the insights around how to build circular economies, the thing that we don't talk about enough is that they are much more effective if the scale at which the circling is happening is a regional scale. It can't be a vast global scale. Moving things over vast distances in order to put them into circular loops isn't effective. So we need to also be aware, and that's why I'm highlighting the biomaterials element, that in this, I'm just going to go back briefly, if you look at that very famous Al MacArthur slide with the two metabolisms, you have the biomaterials metabolism and you have the industrial metabolism. And one of the slight oversales of the circular economy so far is that you can somehow upcycle in the industrial materialism cycle, that you can actually create higher valuable materials by cycling them in the right way. And in very minute exceptions that might have been demonstrated, but by and large this runs against the second law of thermodynamics. And it also runs against the fact that many of the key elements that we now need for our even renewable technologies are beginning to run out. And the amount of energy we have to put into getting at the reserves that are still in the ground is getting more and more, while at the same time producing that energy from fossil fuels is becoming more and more expensive. So we have an energetic and a mineralogical limit to being able to create circular economies based on materials that come out of the ground. So the only way that we can reinvent the human presence on Earth and create regenerative systems and at the same time draw down carbon from the atmosphere and begin to reverse climate change is to shift towards biomaterials, towards materials that we can grow, that capture carbon either naturally or to some extent we have left it so late that we probably also need to do this with synthetic chemistry in the laboratory and in industrial settings. But this process does sequester carbon into our material culture, into our buildings, into everything we use. Right now, most of the things around us are somehow derivatives of the petrochemical industry. The minute we stop using fossil fuels, these byproducts, these waste products that we have turned into plastics and nylon and so many other materials that are central to our material culture, will become, if we have less byproducts because we use less fossil fuels, then we need to shift our entire material culture. And there's, I mentioned the energetic limit. This shows that throughout the last 40 years and projected into the future, what is happening is that to just maintain the energy infrastructure and the ability to run our economy has become more and more expensive energetically. And if you look at that little red arrow on the side, this is the disposable income with which we can innovate and create new structures for humanity. And it's getting smaller and smaller because we have to invest more and more of our energy into just maintaining the system as it is. So I'm giving you 3 reasons, climate, energy, and materials, that the system as it is right now cannot continue. This report came out in September, and it's from the Global Center for Adaptation. It's an urgent call that we need leadership from political leaders at the regional scale and the national scale to begin to prepare for what's coming. Because even if we do all the right things, the next 3 decades are going to be a bumpy ride. Even if we started within the next 3 or 4 years, the COP in Madrid starts next week, and the crunch point will be the meeting in Glasgow next year, where we have to not just agree and begin to implement the Paris Agreement, but go much beyond it. But even if we did all that, because of the lag in the climate system, things are going to get worse for at least another 15 to 20 years, despite all our actions to try to steer against it. And we need to prepare people for understanding that there is a lag in the climate system, that what the climate change we're experiencing right now is not about the emissions that we've emitted in the last 3, 5, 10 years, but the emissions prior to that. It takes a while for our emissions to actually become active in the climate system. And that means it will also take a while for our positive actions and our drawdown to show an effect. Let me just land this closer to tourism. This is from a conference that I went to in September, invited by Visit Flanders, where an entire regional development board of the region of Flanders in Belgium is already beginning to ask the question, how can we transform the way we travel? How can we transform tourism in a way that it really becomes a way of serving the local community and the needs of the local community, and that we strengthen the positive effects of tourism and decrease the negative effects. And you can find that talk online. It's a very similar presentation to the one today. And this is from, like, this image here of the elm tree is central to this Travel to Tomorrow program of Visit Flanders. And I'm just going to take you through some of this. It's just a summary of how regenerative tourism can support what Visit Flanders is already embarking on. And my big hope here in Mallorca would be that Mallorca has already exported a model of tourism to the world. Mass all-inclusive tourism was pretty much invented on Mallorca and the Canary Islands, and it has gone everywhere. And some Mallorcan families are the owners of 4 of the 20 largest tourism businesses in the world. We showed, or Mallorca showed leadership before. Well, maybe it is time to show leadership again and to develop a new model, because island scales are ideal for developing models, and then invite the global industry to copy the model again. And because many of the Mallorcan businesses are now global businesses, the opportunity really is there. And to just take you through some of this, regenerative practice means connecting people with each other and their place. It is about building the capacity of people in place to help themselves. It is about increasing civic participation in this transformation we now have to do, and to create local economic multipliers. What do I mean by that? Just to give you concrete examples. If the main players in Mallorcan tourism got together and said, okay, let's build a solar thermal power plant behind Magaluf, and let's build another one behind Arenal, and manage our portfolio as an industry, become more diverse in what we offer, not only offer tourism, but also become energy producers and become our own customers. So in this transition period, the hotels are powered by energy generated renewably by cooperatives that are partially owned by the tourism industry and partially owned by the people of Mallorca. Then if tourism contracts, you also have a separate business. You have the business of generating renewable energy, and you can sell that to the population who still is here, or use it for the new type of tourism offers that we might develop in the future. Repurposing the infrastructure here on Mallorca to have people come for much longer stays, people who are maybe retired, transforming hotels into basically places where high economic income or people who are retired from Northern Europe can spend 3-4 months in the winter living in a sheltered living, geriatric care type environment in an infrastructure that used to be a hotel. The same way we were talking about knowledge transfer and the potential of education. Mallorca has a massive potential of not just having one university or taking its university a lot more serious and bringing people to Mallorca for longer periods of time, and with it bringing intellectual capital to Mallorca. So we really need to rethink the potential that we have in reinventing this island and reinventing tourism in the process, and with it help play our part in this transformation we now so urgently need to make as humanity. I'll skip through this just to give you a couple of examples of, I've been here for 9 years, and these are just some projects that I've been involved in, and they're kind of acupuncture points in the system. They're not really, they haven't transformed very much. They started conversations, but just to demonstrate that this is not just theory, that there is a practice behind this. So one of the projects was together with a friend of mine and the Fundación Educación per la Vida to re-energize the ancient pilgrim routes from the different corners of Mallorca up to Yuc, the holy forest, Lucos, Bosque Sagrado, as a way of inviting people into a new connection with the land, a different type of tourism. Then I worked with Pep-Uis Pons on a project where I brought the Belgian detergent company Ecoware to Mallorca to look at Mallorca as a regional test field for a circular biomaterials economy. We looked at, could we potentially use waste streams from forestry, from municipal organic waste, from agriculture, and then biodigest those waste streams, turn them into the chemicals that would then become the building blocks for detergents to clean the floors of tourism establishments, to launder the laundry, the towels, and so on, to create hand soaps, but to do so entirely based on Mallorcan waste streams. And we, as part of that, we did a study of all the biomaterials flows of the island, which was rudimentary, but it was a beginning of understanding what do we have to work with. And one of the things that came out was that the regulator needs to have a key role in how to use biomaterial resources in a cascading way. That's part of the circular economy, that you try to get as much use out of your material as possible. And just as in nature you have trophic levels in ecosystems and a cascading down those trophic levels, where as much is done with as little energy as possible, we need to create a biomaterials economy that does the same. The other graphic that I'll show in bigger in a second is from the work that I've done with Baleares Te here between 2012 and 2014, and Miguel Payeras is in the audience. And so this was in 2012. I made suggestions that still could be implemented, but haven't moved that far. Some of them have begun to be in the public discourse. The recent film about the plastic issues, I worked as a consultant on that. I've been giving talks on circular economy here on the island for 3-4 years. In 2015, we launched the Fourth Sector Network on Mallorca. Been involved in many different educational initiatives, and this 2 documentaries, Illes del Futur, they're available online, just tell little stories about community resilience on Mallorca. This is the graphic that was part of the report for Baleares Te that I did. And it's, again, if you have the time to look through the presentation again, it's worth looking at some of the suggestions from 2012, because we've wasted some time. We could have really moved into this earlier, and now the urgency is such that we really need to begin to bring people together to see how do we transform this island so our children and children's children have a future on this island. I like putting this in. It's a shame that it never got finalized. This was a project we worked on for 3 years that already had funding from the FICIT from Madrid, and then fell victim to local politics around the Port Petit in the Molinar. The idea was that in order to use public education, like to just create over 1,400 meters along the Paseo Marítimo of the Molinar, the story of the known universe, where in Portichol you start with the Big Bang 14 billion years ago, and by the time you get to the little bridge near Ciudad Jardín, you arrive in the present. And over 35 panels telling the story that connects people back into the natural system, that makes people understand how dependent we are of the life-supporting cycles of the biosphere. And just one of the things that one of the panels tells is that any of you having a wedding band on, the gold atoms in your wedding band need the kind of pressure and heat that can only be generated by the death of a star. So if you wear any gold on you, you're wearing the death of a star on your finger. Everything is connected. And it's the same with we are made from stardust. And by re-enchanting the populace in a public exhibition like that, as they go for a walk on a Sunday, with this living cosmos that we are part of, we begin to undo the damage of this false story that somehow nature and culture are separate, and somehow our technological and scientific innovations can take us out of the system and save the day. Yes, we need technology. We will need technology to undo the damage that we've done. But we also need to make a shift in consciousness, in awareness. Another project that just recently got inaugurated is I've been working with Professor Tomeo Serra and Tony Sola from the WIB on this concept of smart UEV since the beginning for by now 4 years. And we've been running a number of capacity building courses through the UIB, from transition design through courses that engage people with the sustainable development goals, new frameworks of thinking about innovation, and also bringing biomimetic innovation to the island. And one of the projects is Casas Eusius that has just been inaugurated earlier this month. And the hope for this center is to become a small place where we can have, as people here on the island can have the conversations of how we can work together to make the change that is now so urgently needed. And one of the things I'm kind of proud of trying to take smart UIB out of just the big data and large algorithms realm of things is that we changed SMART into an acronym and turned it into sustainable, multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholders, applied, regenerative and resilient, and transformative. And through that have given Smart UIB a much larger remit within the context of this larger transformation that we're talking about here. So at Visit Flanders, this conference on travel tomorrow, it was organized by a tourism consultant with 40 years experience in consulting destinations about how to transform their touristic offer, as a friend of mine called Anna Pollock. And if you look at this little quote up there, she said this in 1995. She had the vision that tourism could actually be a healing business, that it could be a force for renewal and a force for transformation, and that it should take that role seriously. And this graphic is also from her, and it basically shows that we need to go beyond caring about shareholders to caring about stakeholders, but we need to go even beyond that and shift from this man over nature, mechanistic, technology will save the day thinking to a living systems thinking, to understand our dependence on this living system that we're part of, and then really care for the whole community and the wider planet. And as we do so, we move from working degeneratively to working regeneratively. So really, it's not about how do we catalyze transformations of tourism. That's just part of the step. It's the bigger question behind that, and that's really the question I want to leave you with and invite us to contemplate over the next 2 days, is how can we transform tourism into being a catalyst of the larger transformation we now need. And there's hardly a place on planet Earth that could do this in a more meaningful way than this island, because 85% of our economy is directly or indirectly dependent on tourism. So if we want to turn things around, we have to turn the problem into the solution, and we have to experiment with new ways of creating tourism. These are just some of the things that we could lead at. We could lead at creating decentralized renewable energy production systems. We could phase out coal and gas completely from this island using solar thermal and photovoltaics and wind where it's adequate. Then we could also drastically work with inviting the tourism industry to buy closer to home and to understand that local regenerative agriculture and organic farming on this island is preserving the beauty of this island. Farmers are guardians of ecosystems. They're guardians of the beauty of the landscape. And if we invest more in buying locally, I know for a fact, I've talked to lots of people, the current Director General de Agricultura, that local farming could produce a lot, if not all, of the basic food needs of this island if we actually bought from them. But since we prefer to buy far away, cheap, cost managing the magic of getting more and more out of less and less, the fact that most 4-star hotels on Mallorca deliver breakfast, lunch, and dinner for a budget of about 7 to 9 euros, maybe we need to spend a little bit more money there and understand that process, if we spend it locally, creates so many multipliers in the system that it actually makes our society a richer society and a much more climate resilient society. Because of the scale of this island, we could be world leading in phasing out the internal combustion engine and bringing in electric transport, but to do so not in a way that we have more and more cars and have on a small island like this, the Via Cinturón de Palma, blocking up every morning and every afternoon. Let's innovate transport in a truly innovative way and innovate in public electric transport and find new ways of moving people around the island with less cars. Then we need to do a lot of research at the university on new biomaterials. We can reforest analog forests here on Mallorca that are drawing down carbon but also provide the biomaterials of the production facilities of the future. And in doing so, we can develop know-how that we could sell to the rest of the world. Because it's really important that we diversify the economy of this island and contract a little bit the role that tourism is playing and build up other industries. And again, tourism could be the catalyst of that. And I've already mentioned some ideas of how can we repurpose the tourism infrastructure over the long term and prepare for a time where maybe there are less flights arriving, but we find new offers to keep visitors here for longer and transform the infrastructure in that way. And yeah, I'll leave it at that and just give you one particular concrete example of what we could do in 2020 if there's willingness in the room to have this conversation. These people are among the leading people in terms of reinventing the economic system, in terms of using biomimetic innovation. Janine Benyus founded she coined the word biomimicry and bio-inspired innovation. Nora Bateson is the daughter of the famous systems thinker Gregory Bateson and has developed a process called warm data labs, where we work with transcontextual data and bring all this wealth of knowledge that we've created in silos back together again and understand in a more holistic way how to work with data. Anna Pollock, I already mentioned, she's a leading tourism thinker for the last 40 years, and Stuart Cohen works with the Capital Institute in New York on regenerative capitalism. And all these people are willing to come to Mallorca and use Mallorca as the test field for developing a new methodology that Kate Rayworth and Janine Benyus have already started to develop with the C40 cities, the Carbon 40 climate change mayor network around the world. They already started this process which is called Thriving Places, using the donut and the biomimicry thinking tool called the Citrus to invite local players into a 3-day workshop where you really start to look at how do we fundamentally redesign the system. And we're currently looking at bringing all of us together for 3 to 5 days, possibly in Nuuk next year, to use Mallorca as a test field and invite maybe 60 people from different industries and walks of life representatives to spend 3 days with us to let us try out this new methodology we're trying to develop and then give us feedback on how it would work. That would then ultimately reach regions all around the globe. But what it would allow us here on Mallorca to do is to basically have an invitation for free learning with some of the key thinkers in this area. And again, put Mallorca on the map as being leading in this. So that's my offer to people in the room to have this conversation. We're probably going to do it anyway, but of course it will be so much more powerful if the right people are in the room and we get political buy-in and industry buy-in to make this happen. So thank you very much. And there's a little bit of time for questions. I don't actually know the time, how long I've spoken, but yeah, please, questions, feedbacks, over to you. Anybody? Also, I'm always very happy to hear critical reflections because I'm aware that this is putting you on the spot a little bit with regard to what the rest of the next 2 days will be about, which is much smaller, transforming little things within tourism to make tourism a little better. But how does this land with tourism professionals such as you to say, no, we need to do much more. We can actually use tourism as a catalyst for civilizational change, or at very least societal change here at the scale of Mallorca.
Hi, good morning. My name is Anne. I work at the Fundación BIT. You have met with many politicals in the last year. What, to your opinion, is their main obstacle to make this type of decision? Because it seems clear that we have to make decisions toward this way. But it seems that after 20 years talking about climate change, nobody takes any decisions.
Yeah. It's 50.
So why are they don't act?
I think it's political systems are slow to respond everywhere around the world, but what I've noticed with that view of the outsider who's now lived here 8-9 years is that while the political spectrum in Spain is transforming, but it was very strongly a two-party system until recently, and I always found it really heart-wrenching, no matter who was voted out and voted in, the way that the first 6 to 8 months, it seems like nothing is happening apart from killing the good ideas of the previous administration because it was invented by the others. And this kind of thinking that we still think in these blocks of whether it's red or blue, the block, it doesn't matter. We need to make decisions that are in the long-range future for humanity, for the local population, and that means getting out of the ping-pong of one political party implementing one strategy and then the other one comes in 4 years later, destroys that and does something else, sometimes literally because it's been so successful that it's hard for them to accept that the previous ones also did something successful. So we need to create a long-range gremium, some form of council for the future of Mallorca, where we have representatives of all the parties, but also of civil society and research, and begin to fix certain decisions over the long term and say, this is our long-term journey, and we have different political opinions of how to get there, but we agree on where we need to go and implement somehow a longer trajectory. And then things happen that people are now so worried of being the guy who signs the paper on some kind, like for example with Smart OEB. There are almost 10 million euros in funding waiting to flow towards Smart OEB. But there has been hesitance to sign the last little bit of bureaucracy because people don't want to be caught out if such a big project ends up not going well. So at the same time, also the leadership of the university isn't putting 100,000 or 150,000 into the administrative spending of being able to land 10 million. For me, that it's a no-brainer. If you can bring in 10 million and only spend 150,000, that's good business for the university. But the bureaucracy is slowing things down here in a way that is really painful to notice. And also we don't value the importance of knowledge and innovation and strategy. Like I'm here gladly speaking to you for free. But Visit Flanders paid me 5,000 euros to give a similar talk. Maybe that's too much. But in reality, to constantly, like I would love to engage more locally, but every time I've tried to engage here locally, it's the innovation, oh, you want to save the world, so do it for free. And so I'm telling this very personal story as an example of that we don't value what we have locally. There are many people here that would really significantly contribute to the future of Mallorca, but they're working elsewhere in the world because we don't value the quality of people we actually have on the island. Yeah? Thank you. Thank you.
Could you expand a little bit on the role of tourists, the role you think that the tourists should play?
The tourist or the tourism industry?
Not the industry, but tourists themselves. And what role the tourist institutions should play in educating, so as to say, the tourists?
Let me just see briefly if I can. Yeah, just as a very tiny example of something really beautiful but minute, have a look at this tureco.es. It's a young woman who I taught on a sustainability course when I just arrived here, and she's since set up this business. And it basically is a Mallorcan business that enables tourists to come and be part of the Vendimia, be part of the almond harvest, to actually spend some days with a merger building stone walls in the Tramontana. It's tourism experiences that bring the tourist into a really deep, heartfelt connection with the island and the traditions of this island. And so those kind of offers are one way of engaging the tourist more. Then we've got the ecotasa, but where do we spend the money? Like if we were really, really transparent, of full transparency accounting of how much money has come in from the ecotasa and where is it going, and make tourists, engage tourists with being able to visit the projects that they financed through the ecotasa. Again, I think that's a very good mechanism of engaging the tourists more. And of course, I mean, some of the tourism that we've got in Arenal and Magaluf is a kind of tourism that isn't necessarily desirable by anybody, and I think even like the industry is already doing a lot to get away from this sort of party. And can we? I have a lot of feedback right now. Can we turn this down a little bit, the mic? Anyway, so the willingness is there for people to be part of this. Like Visit Flanders has done a lot of studies, and I encourage people from the industry to look at this Travel to Tomorrow initiative, because they're really leading and have done a lot of the work. People are willing to pay more if there is not just a story, but a real action behind what they're financing with their tourism. And people want to engage, not in a kind of superficial sangria and whatever else, but to actually learn something here. And for me, that potential is really not like, how many top-level academics and top-level researchers could we bring to Mallorca? You wouldn't even have to pay them more. If you headhunt, like one of my pet ideas is Mallorca is building an entire new industry in nautical engineering, to become leading in not in the building, not in the wharfs, but in the knowledge and the development of the marine transport systems of the future. And for the wealth that we have on this island to invest in a long-range strategy, say, let's put 500 million on the table from private and European money, and basically make this the knowledge center for nautical engineering in the Mediterranean, and identify the 6 or 7 key leaders in that field. There's a company in Australia, there's a company in Germany, and just headhunt the top innovators and say, we'll pay you what you get up there, but you get to live on Mallorca and do your research on Mallorca. I actually think we could attract a lot of intellectual capital to begin to build a long-range strategy that, on the one hand, solves some of the main issues for the tourism industry globally, but also creates in the process a diversification of our economic portfolio here on the island. Okay, I know that we could have a much longer conversation. Anybody else? Yeah?
Good morning, my name is Miguel. In one of your slides, you speak about public transport, electrical. Mm-hmm. Could you share with us your vision on that? I mean, to go a little bit further, or is it just one sentence?
I think one of the issues that we have to be aware of is that what just recently happened in Bolivia was probably about lithium mining. So increasingly, we've already seen this with a lot of the wars over the last 20 years have been fought either over oil or over water. Increasingly, we will get political destabilization and wars and regime change due to the key minerals that we need to build the renewables infrastructure. And electric transport is an issue in the sense that it is, to my mind, part of the future of mobility, but it cannot be part of the future of mobility if it's still based on the idea that every one of us has their own vehicle and that people drive around town with one person per vehicle. But since we are on an island where the distances are ideal, so issues of range are really not a problem because people will not drive more than 280 kilometers in a day. It gives us an opportunity to really, if you just look at where we used to have train lines on this island, and how many of them have been ripped up. It's again a pattern that we see everywhere. But there used to be a tramway to Arenal that went around, along the front of where I live in the Molinar. If we really invested in a renewable energy-based infrastructure that is less private vehicles, more buses, but also more rail systems, we could also make Parma a much quieter city, a less polluted city, and in the process make it more attractive again. So the issue of electric transport is critical and nuanced because the one thing that we can't do is have 2 million electric cars on the island. And also as a global solutions, we can't have quite so many private vehicles. But there are key players, even investors, people, somebody who invested in building the rapid transport system in Colombia lives on this island, and he rolled out electric charging stations all over Colombia. And again, there's no local entry point sometimes. We've heard political promises that we needed 2,000 charging stations about 6 or 7 years ago, and I haven't done the research recently, but my guess is we'll probably have 200 or 400, but certainly not 2,000. So there's a long way to go, but even just the mediatic and the transfer effect that El Hierro in the Canaries has pretty much already done it, but El Hierro is a very small island. It's a great test case, but if we took something like El Hierro and said, we can do this at the scale of Mallorca, then this is significant for every island around the Mediterranean. We could become part of an island-wide network and begin to knowledge transfer to other islands how we did it. But because of the scale of Mallorca, it is actually a wonderful example of re-regionalization. It is the kind of scale that we need to re-regionalize production and consumption and transport systems and key food systems and water systems all over the globe, not just on islands. And so that's where I see this huge potential of getting into conversation with industry to say, come and work with us. Let's do it. Let's show the world it's possible on Mallorca. And because everybody, so many people know this island, like the mediatic effect always is amplified if something happens on Mallorca because people have a relationship to it, whether it's a childhood holiday or a holiday home on the island or whatever, but all of Northern Europe and the world is aware that this island exists. We're not nobody. So yeah, huge potential. I'm waiting for somebody to stop me. I don't have the time on me, but I'm gladly continuing to have a conversation. And any more comments? If somebody wants to speak in Spanish, that's fine. I can answer in English if you feel more confident asking the question in Spanish. Is that it? Well, thank you so much for your time.